What's the climate like in your country? Hot? Cold? Wet? Dry? What makes a climate?
Why, for example, are some parts of the world wetter than others? In Britain, the west coast is the wettest part. This waterfall is in Wales. There's a lot of water here in Wales because it rains a lot here. But why? The prevailing wind in Britain is from the west. And out there, to the west, is the Atlantic Ocean. The wind from the ocean is a very wet wind. The air is very warm and it can hold a lot of water. This warm, wet wind comes in and it meets the hills. And when it meets the hills push the air up. But up in the hills, it's colder, and the air can hold less water. Clouds form, and the water falls as rain. So there are a lot of lakes here in Wales. These lakes make Wales one of the most beautiful parts of Britain. And every year, thousands of tourists come here for sailing and fishing. These lakes also provide a lot of the water for the towns and cities in England, where the climate is drier. Rain is also good for grass, and grass is good for sheep.
Here, in Kent, on the east coast of England, we're further away from the Atlantic Ocean. The climate here is much drier. The wind from the west loses most of its rain over Wales and western England, so we get less rain here. The most important crop in this part of Britain is wheat. Wheat needs a warm, dry climate.
There are vineyards here too. And because the southeast of England is the driest and sunniest part of Britain, it's one of the most popular places for summer holidays. But of course, the British weather is very unpredictable.
Look at these houses. They're made of wood. You won't see buildings like these in Wales. But not everything is better here in the east. It's drier and sunnier, but the weather here is often worse in the winter.
Over there is Russia. When the wind blows from the east, it doesn't come from the warm Atlantic. It comes from the ice and snow of Siberia. You did a project on farming recently, didn't you?
Yeah.
What things did you find out?
Well, we found out that farming is quite a difficult thing and it depends a lot on the weather.
Can you tell me more about that? How does it depend on the weather?
Well, if it's very hot, so it's not so good for the crops. And if it rains too much, it's not so good either. So you need exactly a good amount of everything.
What did you find out in your project, Lucy?
Well, we found out about the crops and where they grew best, and also which animals, whether they're better in wet circumstances or drier.
Can you give me some examples of animals that like wet climates?
Well, the cows are normally kept in wet climates because of the grass, like good quality grass.
They grow different crops in different parts of Britain. Did you learn something about that?
Yeah. Well, most of England's weather comes from the west, from the Atlantic. And usually it hits the mountains, the Pennines, and it rains on the western side. And on the eastern side it's less wet, so they grow more crops on the eastern side than what they grow on the west side.
What kind of crops do they grow in eastern Britain?
Well, maize, barley, wheat, oats.
Why do they grow those crops in eastern Britain?
Because it's quite dry there and it's good for harvesting.
What kind of farms are there in the west of Britain?
Or dairy farms and cattle and sheep.
Britain had its warmest winter for 100 years in 1989 and the worst storms for 300 years in 1987. Is our climate changing? I went to the Hadley Centre for Climate Research. What's happening to our climate?
Some people believe that our climate is changing and that the Earth is getting warmer.
Why?
Well, in Britain over the last few years, we have had several mild and dry winters and a hot summer. And in the last 3 years, we have had 2 very severe storms in the south of England. Globally, the surface temperature of the Earth has risen by about half a degree in the last century, and 8 out of the last 10 years have been the warmest on record.
Why is all this happening?
The climate is affected by many factors. Natural changes in volcanoes and in the oceans and in the sun's heat can affect climate, but many people believe that we are changing climate by adding gases called greenhouse gases, like carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. These gases come from things like power stations, factories and cars, and they trap heat in the atmosphere.
What will happen if the Earth's temperature rises?
The ice at the North Pole will probably melt and sea level will rise. This will flood many parts of the world, and some Pacific islands may well disappear altogether.
If our climate is changing, it will be more serious for the east than the west. The land here is flatter and lower. If the sea level rises, most of this land will disappear under the sea. And then a wet valley in Wales will be a better place to be.
The Earth is getting warmer.
Why, for example, are some parts of the world wetter than others?
The climate here is much drier. We're further away from the Atlantic Ocean.
The air can hold less water.
But not everything is better here in the east. The weather here is often worse in the winter.
It will be more serious for the east than the west.
On the eastern side, it's less wet.
The west coast is the wettest part. The southeast of England is the driest and sunniest part of Britain.
Britain had its warmest winter for 100 years in 1989 and the worst storms for 300 years in 1987. The most important crop in this part of Britain is wheat.